So in the world of lean product development and product ownership, it's really important to have a product backlog that is minimal but sufficient. You don't want a product backlog that has thousands of things in it, or even hundreds of things if you've only got one team. It's going to be really difficult for product management, for a product owner, to understand all of the things that are in the product backlog, right? In order to find the value, you have to understand all of the things that are in the product backlog. You have to know what it all is so that you can go find those things that are the most valuable things in there. So one of the phrases that I normally use is your product backlog is a lean inventory, right? From a product owner's perspective, that is their inventory, like in a warehouse, right? The product backlog is the stuff that they're managing, that they're giving love, care, and attention to, that they're trying to get value out of by marketing it, by testing the market, getting little ideas out. So creating a lean inventory, minimal but sufficient, right, is the best way to focus your ideas on the product backlog. One of the things I quite often hear is that, but if I don't put it in my product backlog, we'll forget about it. You only forget about the stuff that's irrelevant. The ideas that are great, those great ideas that you have, are the type of things that you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and remember. You're not going to forget those things. Even if you don't write them down at all, you're not going to forget those things. So what is a good size of product backlog? This idea of minimal but sufficient, just enough, right? But what does that look like? Well, there's not going to be a hard and fast rule. I would normally say a rule of thumb, and it's just a rule of thumb, is this sprint plus 2 more, right? Looking forward into the future. That's a good place to start. That might not be where you end up. You'll need to look at, as you're delivering stuff in the context of that product backlog, the context of your product in your organization, you're going to need to be looking about and seeing, did we need a little bit more in a particular sprint? In which case, maybe we need to look a little bit further out. Do we need a little bit less, right? Because we're looking too far out. We're building up lots of stuff in our backlog. How do we reduce that size? Stop adding things to it is one way to do that. And then you get it down to a more manageable size, and then you can flex it. What is the Goldilocks zone for your organization and your backlog? You also need to take into account things that you need to know. So there's quite often there's that fallacy that we don't need a backlog at all because we're doing agile. And in the most optimal, idealistic world, sure, not having a backlog at all, walking into the sprint review with what we've just delivered for a customer and saying to them, what do you need in the next 2 weeks? And have them feed that backlog to you would be most optimal, right? That gives you the maximum ability to change. But when you're working in larger organizations, when you're working in multinational organizations, there's probably other things that happen in your organization that you don't have any control over. There are other things. I'm thinking of a really bad example. This is an extreme example, but I used to work for a large bank back in the day. And we had a 6-week lead time for firewall changes because that's organizationally designed, organizationally approved by security and compliance. So if we needed to have a firewall change made for our application to function correctly, and they had firewalls inside the organization as well, they were very paranoid, then I needed to know about it 6 weeks in advance. I couldn't turn up at my sprint planning, build it out, go together, and then halfway through the sprint go, oh, we need this firewall change. Not going to happen. It's going to take 6 weeks to get that into production because it has to be validated, it has to be tested, it has to be validated with other applications in the organization. security, pen testing, all of those things have to happen. So you need to be looking 6 weeks out for this particular circumstance. You need to be looking 6 weeks out on your product backlog and see if there are indications of a need for a firewall change that we can ask for within that lead time. And there could be other things. I picked that particular example, but there could be other things that you could know about your product backlog that you can look a little bit further out into the future using, it's a little bit of crystal ball. So sometimes you're going to be right and sometimes you're going to be wrong. Further out into the future you look, the more wrong you're likely to be because the world changes. But how far do you have to look for specific things in order to maximize your ability to deliver those things within the sprint? And you have to balance how much effort you spend on that versus the return, right? For not getting things quite as wrong is the wrong word, right? But not quite being ready for those things when they arrive. But the reality is you want to have as little upfront done as possible because that maximizes your ability to change direction and minimize waste, right? Because you could turn up at that sprint review, and the customer says, this is great, this is awesome, I love what you've done with this stuff, but now let's go this way. And suddenly all of that backlog that you had going forward into the future is now irrelevant and we need to move over onto something else. And how do you manage that and make sure that you've not wasted too much time? There's always going to be some waste in that backlog. So as a product owner, practice lean product development. Use those minimal but sufficient ideas and find that Goldilocks zone for how much information and how big your product backlog needs to be.